My name is Natalie, and I learned the difference between being forgotten and being excluded when the people closest to me made plans that never included my name. It wasn't a scheduling error, a missed message, or a simple oversight. It was silence, where there should have been belonging. A choice, not an accident, and that distinction cuts deeper than most are willing to admit. They planned it down to the details: flights booked early, accommodations reserved, itinerary organized, and excitement building like electricity. The countdown to Christmas was marked with joy for them and distance for me. I wasn't asked. I wasn't told. I wasn't even mentioned. There were no, "What are your dates?" No, "Will you be free that week?" No, "We hope you can make it." Just a growing gap, decorated in their happiness, made wider by my quiet realization. The signs were never obvious at first. They never are. It began with subtle shifts: group chats buzzing more than usual, pictures of resorts and snow-covered, cabins, little emojis, and inside jokes forming around places I hadn't heard about. I noticed their excitement but didn't yet know the context. I gave them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe something small. Maybe just ideas. Maybe I'll hear from them soon. But time passed, and silence grew, until the silence said more than any invitation ever could. One day it became clear, not through confrontation, not through conversation, but through confirmation. A family photo posted, cheerful and perfect, with matching scarves and Christmas mugs, standing in front of a fireplace that didn't belong to anyone's home. The caption, "Annual Christmas Magic with my favorite people." And in that picture, every smile was present, except mine. The trip was real. The moment had happened. The decision was made. And I had been left out. Not forgotten. Chosen to be absent. That realization did not crash in suddenly. It unfolded slowly, bitterly, like a truth unwrapped one piece at a time. The weight wasn't just in not being there. It was in knowing that they had known I wasn't included and never felt the need to explain. They had made a list, and I hadn't been on it. They had shared excitement, and I had been excluded from it. It wasn't about the trip. It was about the message beneath it, that I didn't belong in their favorite memories, that my presence wasn't essential to their joy, that my absence wouldn't create a void, that they could celebrate without me, and not one of them thought to question that choice. The pain of exclusion doesn't always scream. Sometimes it settles quietly, leaving you to wonder if you're overreacting. It makes you second-guess your importance. It makes you analyze moments, reread messages, retrace steps to find what you might have done wrong. But the truth is rarely about what you did. It's about what others decided you didn't deserve. The holidays are supposed to be about warmth, connection, belonging, but exclusion during that time feels like a spotlight on your loneliness. It amplifies every small ache. You watch others exchange gifts, hugs, and laughter, while you sit with unanswered questions wrapped in silence. You scroll past pictures of joy and feel the sting of being on the outside, looking in. Not because you left, but because they closed the door before you arrived. What hurts even more is how casually it's done. How simple it is for others to move on without you. How normal it is for them to post, laugh, celebrate, without thinking for a second that maybe someone was quietly watching, silently hurting, trying to understand why they weren't considered. There are few things lonelier than realizing you were never in the plans people made for the things that mattered most to them. No one told me about the departure date. No one asked me if I was spending the holidays alone. No one checked in. They just went, as if it were normal, as if I were invisible. People often say, "You're always welcome," but the truth is, inclusion doesn't live in words. It lives in actions. And when the actions never come, the words lose all weight. Being truly included means being thought of before the moment, not as an afterthought once the moment has passed. I didn't ask for an explanation. I didn't demand an apology. I just watched, listened, and learned. I observed who stayed silent, who avoided the subject, who smiled at me while knowing they had packed their bags and left me behind. And with each passing hour, the wound wasn't just about being left out. It was about being expected to stay quiet about it. People like to avoid discomfort. They don't want confrontation. They don't want to acknowledge the small betrayals they commit. So they act like nothing happened. They return with souvenirs, stories, and smiles, expecting you to catch up as if you had been there. But emotional absence doesn't disappear just because physical presence returns. The worst part is how easy it is for them to pretend it's not a big deal, to brush it off as a misunderstanding, to say, "We thought you were busy," or "It was just a small thing." But Christmas is never a small thing. It's family, it's tradition, it's togetherness. And when you're not included in that, you're not just left out of a trip, you're left out of belonging. And so I sat with that truth, not with bitterness, but with clarity. The realization that sometimes people show you exactly where you stand, not by what they say, but by what they don't do. They didn't forget me. They erased me. Quietly, painlessly, efficiently, as if I had never been part of their plans at all. That kind of exclusion doesn't require loud conflict. It's 1,000 small absences that add up to one undeniable truth. They didn't want me there. And when someone doesn't want you in their joy, you stop offering your presence. I didn't confront. I didn't accuse. I let their silence speak. I let the pictures tell their story. I let their choices define the new shape of the relationship. Because once you realize you weren't considered, you stop waiting to be chosen. Christmas passed, and so did the need for justification. What remained was understanding. A kind of cold, clear understanding that you can love people who don't know how to love you back. That you can forgive them without forgetting how they made you feel. That you can still wish them well while quietly choosing to protect yourself. Because when the people you call family celebrate without you and expect you to be okay with it, they're not just asking for silence, they're asking for self-erasure. And sometimes, the greatest act of self-respect is choosing not to pretend anymore. Grief doesn't always arrive after loss. Sometimes it shows up while things still appear whole on the outside. It creeps in quietly when those who are supposed to choose you simply don't. It doesn't need an ending to begin. It only needs absence in a space where presence was expected. Being left behind is not about geography. It's not about a missed flight or an empty chair. It's about no longer being thought of as part of us. It's the shift from belonging to observing, from inclusion to irrelevance. And that shift doesn't make noise. It makes silence, sharp, suffocating silence that says more than any confrontation ever could. The holiday season turns that silence into an echo chamber. Joy surrounds everything. Laughter becomes louder. Lights are brighter. Music spills from every store, every ad, every passing car. But for the one left behind, all that joy sounds like a language they're no longer fluent in. The lights feel colder. The music feels hollow. Everything reminds them not of what is, but of what should have been. The hardest part is the pretending. Pretending it doesn't matter. Pretending the exclusion was accidental. Pretending to be above the sting when every ornament, every card, every wreath reminds you of the space you didn't fill. Because someone else decided you shouldn't. Grief wrapped in silence is the most invisible kind. No one asks about it. No one acknowledges it. There are no rituals, no condolences, no understanding glances. Just the steady beat of holiday cheer pressing against a heart that wasn't invited. A heart still loyal to people who didn't see. It is part of their celebration. There's a weight to watching traditions unfold without you. To knowing the table was set, jokes were shared, gifts were exchanged, all without your name ever being spoken. It isn't the distance that hurts, it's the choice. The conscious decision to build memories without you, and the assumption that you'd quietly accept it. And what follows isn't anger. Not first. First comes confusion. 1,000 questions that lead nowhere. Why wasn't I included? Did I do something wrong? Was I too much? Not enough? When did I stop being family in the ways that mattered most? The mind loops these questions like a song stuck on repeat, each answerless refrain digging deeper. Eventually, confusion makes room for realization. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet, heavy kind, the kind that makes you sit still for longer than usual, the kind that turns noise into background, the kind that turns memories into mirrors. You start to see the signs, all the times you excused. Their distance forgave their forgetfulness, made room for their silence. You thought love meant being the one who understood, who waited, who never asked for much. But maybe that taught them you'd always be fine with less. Then grief moves into the body. It shows up in the things you don't say, in the unread messages, in the social media posts you skip, in the conversations you avoid, in the forced smiles when someone asks how your holidays were, in the ache in your chest when you say, "It was fine," knowing that's the farthest thing from the truth. Because it wasn't just a missed vacation, it was proof that you're no longer part of we. That somewhere along the way, they stopped picturing you when they pictured joy. That when they imagined warmth, they didn't imagine you in it. That their perfect holiday wasn't imperfect without you. That realization is its own kind of mourning. A mourning not for what happened, but for what didn't. For what should have been offered freely. A place, a welcome, a thought. Mourning, the way you once belonged, before you became optional. Mourning the connection that now only runs one way. Mourning the version of you that would have still made excuses for them. There's no confrontation to be had. There's no moment where they say, "Yes, we chose to leave you out," because that would require acknowledging what they did. Instead, they smile like nothing happened. They speak like the silence meant nothing. They assume your hurt is an overreaction. They shift the blame to your sensitivity, because that's easier than facing their own lack of care. And so, you're left to hold it all alone. The grief, the questions, the rewriting of your place in the story. You replay old holidays, the ones where you were included, where your laughter filled rooms and your presence was expected. You remember the time before you became invisible in your own family. And you try to understand when that shift happened, when you went from being essential to being excluded without explanation. But there's no timestamp for that kind of fading. It happens gradually. A missed call, a forgotten invitation, a conversation you weren't part of, and then suddenly, you're not part of the tradition anymore. They've moved on, and you're still standing in a version of love that no longer exists. The pain isn't in the new tradition, it's in being written out of the old one without notice. And yet, you carry it with grace, because that's what's expected. No scene, no drama, just quiet. But inside, grief grows roots. It doesn't just sit in the heart, it spreads into how you see yourself. You begin to question your worth, your place, your importance. You wonder if you were ever as valued as you believed, if you ever truly belonged, and the worst part is how you begin to shrink yourself. You stop reaching out as much. You stop offering to help. You stop suggesting plans, because the fear of being left out again becomes louder than the desire to connect. You build walls, not out of anger, but out of protection, because nothing hurts like being hopeful in front of people who consistently choose not to see you. But even in that pain, there's a quiet power, because grief, when honored, teaches you things joy never could. It teaches you how to hold yourself, how to recognize false belonging, how to spot the difference between being included and being tolerated. It teaches you the value of presence, not just being there, but being welcomed. And slowly you stop grieving what was lost. You start building something new, a kind of love that includes you, a kind of tradition that you don't have to be invited into because you created it for yourself. One where you no longer beg for a seat at someone else's table, but build your own, even if it starts with just one chair. Because healing from exclusion doesn't always look like being re-invited. Sometimes it looks like remembering your worth, without their permission. Sometimes it looks like letting go without bitterness. Sometimes it looks like saying, "That hurt," and choosing to love yourself louder than their silence ever was. The grief doesn't vanish. It changes shape. It becomes a boundary. It becomes wisdom. It becomes the reason you no longer chase people who are okay with losing you. And as the holidays come again, you feel it. Not the absence, but the shift. The way you no longer wait for an invitation. The way you light your own tree. The way you smile for real this time. Not because they finally saw you, but because you finally did. Boundaries are rarely loud. They are not made with anger, nor are they drawn to punish. They are quiet decisions made in the privacy of pain. The kind of pain that doesn't ask for revenge, only relief. They are the natural next step after exclusion, the unspoken reply to being left out, and the final line between self-abandonment and self-respect. When someone chooses to leave you behind, they don't imagine you drawing lines in their absence. They assume you will wait in the same place they left you, holding space for their return, eager to forgive without question. They trust your silence more than your strength. That's what makes the boundary so unexpected. The return was inevitable. People who leave often come back as if they never left, dragging their assumptions behind them. They don't prepare for consequences. They prepare for comfort. They carry their version of the story and expect yours to match. They expect the door to be open, the smile to be ready, the disappointment tucked neatly away. But when they return to find that the air has changed, when they come back to discover that something sacred is now closed, they call it cold. Not because it is, but because they were never prepared to face the cost of their choice. Si Montre Rio was never about shutting them out. It was about letting yourself in, about recognizing that being treated as optional isn't something you can keep making room for, about understanding that love given without reciprocity becomes erosion, that the longer you let people leave you out and come back without question, the more invisible you become, even to yourself. Locking the door wasn't dramatic. It was necessary. Not a gesture of cruelty, but a symbol of clarity. The kind of clarity that grows from sitting alone during holidays, from watching the people you called home treat you like a stranger. The kind of clarity that comes when silence gives you time to realize how much you were giving to people who didn't value your place in their world. When they saw the boundary, their reaction wasn't understanding. It was confusion, disbelief, discomfort. Not because they were hurt, but because they were inconvenienced. Because they couldn't believe that the person who always kept the door open had finally decided to close it. Not to keep them out, but to keep herself safe. They called it selfish. They called it overreaction. They used words like dramatic, childish, and unfair. But none of those words applied to what had really happened. What they were really saying was, how dare you stop accepting less than you deserve? What they meant was, we liked you better when you made excuses for us. What they refused to see was that the door they once walked through without thought was now a space protected by someone who finally knew her worth. People who take your presence for granted are always shocked when you reclaim it. The boundary wasn't a wall. It was a decision to no longer entertain half-effort relationships, to no longer stay silent to keep the peace that no one else was keeping, to no longer water connections that didn't offer rain in return, to stop leaving the door open for people who walk in only when it suits them and leave without notice. What they didn't understand was that the boundary wasn't built overnight. It was built over years, over moments, over quiet disappointments, stacked carefully on top of one another. It was built in family dinners where your voice was talked over, in group photos you weren't told about, in conversations that continued without you, in assumptions that you'd always be available, always agreeable, always forgiving. That kind of pattern creates a need for distance, not because you want it, but because it's the only way to breathe. And once you have that space, once you step away from being the one who always bends, you realize how good it feels to stand. The hardest part of setting a boundary is not creating it, it's keeping it. Especially when guilt knocks, when memory whispers, when people use their own discomfort to manipulate your empathy, when they play the role of the hurt party while ignoring the hurt they caused. It takes strength to remember the silence they gave you when it mattered most, to hold your line when they tried to rewrite the story, to resist the urge to comfort them in the face of their own consequences. But peace has a price, and it's often paid in the currency of lost approval. They don't understand that you didn't change overnight. You returned to yourself. You stepped back into the space you had abandoned trying to keep them close. You chose your voice over their comfort, your truth over their narrative, your healing over their expectations. The door they once walked through freely now stands closed, not out of spite, but out of survival. Because after being left behind, You learned that your value cannot depend on people who forget you in the moments that matter most. And once you draw the line, you begin to see things differently. The conversations that once made you anxious now seem irrelevant. The validation you used to crave now feels unnecessary. The love you used to beg for now looks like emotional debt. You don't unlove them, but you unlearn the habit of needing them to love you in return. You stop explaining. You stop justifying. You stop defending boundaries that were built from wounds they never saw. And in that stillness, something new grows. Self-trust, a kind of quiet confidence that tells you it's okay to say, "This is as close as you. Get to me now." Because people will call boundaries selfish when they're used to benefiting from your self-abandonment. They will call them cold when they no longer have unlimited access to your warmth. They will call them unfair when they're forced to face the impact of their absence. But boundaries aren't the problem. The problem is the entitlement that expected access without responsibility. Letting them back in without accountability would have been easier, but it would have cost your peace. Keeping them at a distance was harder, but it gave you space to breathe. And in that space, you found yourself again. Not the version that made herself small to keep others comfortable, but the one who finally understood that love must be mutual, presence must be consistent, and respect must be earned. Not demanded, not assumed, earned. The door may remain closed, or it may open again one day, but not because they knocked loud enough, or cried long enough, or guilted you deep enough. It will only open if they come back changed. If they come back having learned, having owned, having healed. Until then, the lock stays. Not because you hate them, but because you finally learned to love yourself enough to protect your peace. There comes a moment in every story of exclusion when the silence shifts, not into accountability, but into accusation. Not because the people who caused the pain have understood it, but because they're now forced to live with the discomfort of being held at a distance. And rather than face that discomfort with honesty, they repurpose their guilt into blame. Their absence turns into outrage. Their choices become your cruelty. Their forgetting becomes your selfishness. The hurt, without apology, becomes the victim. The people who left you behind now cry out as if they were the ones abandoned. They rewrite the script, paint the story in their favor, and turn the spotlight onto your reaction rather than their behavior. They act stunned by your boundary, shocked by your silence, unsettled by your withdrawal. Not because they didn't see it coming, but because they never thought you would stop accepting less. The moment you choose to protect yourself, you become the villain in a story where they have cast themselves as wounded. You are no longer the person they ignored. You are now the one who changed. You are now the one who took things too personally. You are now dramatic, emotional, cold, ungrateful. They give you labels not to understand you, but to escape accountability for how they made you feel. It is easier for people to shame your response than to examine their actions. Easier to weaponize your healing than to acknowledge your hurt. Easier to mourn the loss of access to you than to reckon with how recklessly they handled your trust. Because when people are not used to being confronted with the impact of their absence, they confuse your boundary with betrayal. They grieve their version of you. The version that was quiet, accommodating, eager to please, endlessly forgiving. That version asked for nothing, accepted everything, and gave more than she received. That version made it easy to pretend there was no problem. That version was convenient. And now that she's gone, they mourn her not because they miss her, but because she kept their image of themselves intact. You were easier to love when you didn't expect anything in return, when you smiled through exclusion, when you excused the things that hurt, when you stayed even when you weren't chosen. But once you stopped pretending, once you chose yourself, their comfort was threatened. And comfort almost always fights back. They begin to tell others their side of the story, a version where you were distant, unpredictable, overreacting. They talk not about what they did, but about how you reacted. They retell the story in ways that erase context, isolate moments, and frame your pain as the problem. Suddenly, the conversation isn't about the Christmas trip you were left out of. It's about how you locked the door. It's not about the silence you endured. It's about the boundary you placed, because consequences make people uncomfortable, especially those who have gone through life without ever facing them. When your absence finally costs them something, they panic. Not because they've changed, but because now they are being asked to. And so they deflect, they tell you you're making a big deal out of nothing, that family is everything, that you should have spoken up if you had a problem. They weaponize the very silence they once depended on. They accuse you of creating drama when all you did was stop participating in their performance. And yet, they never ask the real questions. Why didn't we include her? Why didn't we notice her absence? Why did she have to lock the door before we acknowledged she wasn't in the room? They want peace without accountability, forgiveness without change, reconnection without reflection. They want to be welcomed back without owning what made you walk away. But healing isn't a one-way street, and peace isn't found in letting people pretend they didn't hurt you. So when they start calling you selfish, you have to remember, it's not your boundary that caused their pain. It's the mirror your boundary holds up. It's the image of themselves they now have to confront, the version of events they can no longer hide behind, the access they lost because they never thought they could lose it. People who call you selfish for choosing yourself are often the ones who benefited from your self-neglect. They don't understand that locking the door wasn't punishment. It was protection. That you didn't change overnight. You woke up. That you didn't become cruel. You stopped accepting cruelty dressed in tradition. That family is not defined by blood alone, but by behavior, by consistency, by care. And when they finally realize they no longer control the narrative, they double down. They perform concern. They act wounded. They question your memory. They cast doubt on your intentions. Because if they can't be right, they will try to be pitied. This is what happens when the hurt plays the victim. It's a defense mechanism, one designed to shield them from the truth of what they did. Because accepting that they caused pain would require humility, change, and an apology. And for some, that is far more painful than continuing to hurt others. So instead, they invert the story. You're the problem. You're the reason they feel unwelcome. You're the one making it worse. You should have known better. You're so different lately. You've let yourself be influenced by outsiders. You've forgotten what family means. You've held on to something too long. But you know better. You know that silence is not peace, that boundaries are not betrayal, that choosing yourself is not abandonment, that expecting respect is not entitlement, that refusing to participate in dysfunction is not disloyalty. You know that love that demands you suffer silently is not love at all. So when they start rewriting history, let them. You don't need to correct every version of the story. Truth doesn't need defending when it lives in your body. When your hands remember the door you opened that no one walked through. When your heart remembers the empty chair you never chose to leave behind. When your eyes remember the pictures you weren't in. When your soul remembers the ache of not being chosen, you were there. You felt it. You survived it. You do not owe them your silence to make them feel better about what they did. You do not need to absorb their shame so they can continue to appear innocent. You do not need to pretend you were never hurt to protect people who never protected you. Let them say what they need to say to avoid themselves. Let them perform the story they need to stay comfortable. Let them call you selfish, dramatic, sensitive, cold, because you know what it cost you to stay silent. And now, you know what it costs you to speak. You no longer have to bleed for those who call your healing ungrateful. You no longer have to be the character in their story who keeps forgiving without condition. You are no longer their scapegoat. You are no longer the villain in a narrative they designed to avoid growth. You are the one who remembered your worth. You are the one who refused to be erased quietly. And no matter how loudly they protest, how emotionally they spin, how desperately they try to guilt you, they cannot undo the truth that you were hurt, that they chose not to see it, and that you chose to stop waiting for them to care. This isn't vengeance. It's liberation. And the ones who call that selfish are simply mourning the loss of a version of you that no longer exists. There comes a moment when clarity arrives, not as an explosion, not as a fight, but as a quiet decision made in the heart. A decision that says, I am no longer available for the pain I once allowed. I am no longer willing to explain my worth to people who should have seen it. I am no longer keeping the door open for those who keep walking out. That decision is not anger. It's not bitterness. It's not cruelty. It's truth. And truth, once recognized, cannot be unlived. Choosing. Yourself is not a betrayal of others. It's the end of betraying yourself for their comfort. It's the moment you stop shrinking so others can stretch. It's the moment you stop handing over your peace to people who mistook your loyalty for permission to harm you. People misunderstand what self-respect looks like. They call it cold, they call it distant, they call it unforgiving. But what they don't see is the weight of what came before it. The nights you stayed silent, the times you made space for people who didn't see you, the years you smiled through subtle rejection, the endless moments of being overlooked, dismissed, excluded. They don't see the slow erosion of your trust. They don't feel the ache of being the one who always had to understand, had to forgive, had to keep showing up for people who never returned the gesture. They only see the moment you stopped and confuse that clarity with cruelty. But choosing yourself is not the opposite of love. It is the highest form of it, because it says, I love you enough not to enable you. I love me enough not to abandon myself. I love peace enough to protect it from being poisoned by patterns that only repeat. This choice doesn't come from a desire to punish. It comes from a need to heal. It's the quiet rebalancing of what was never fair to begin with. It's the soft reclaiming of time, energy, and heart from places where it was wasted. It's the understanding that continuing to participate in someone else's indifference is not grace. It's self-neglect. The final realization doesn't always arrive with words. Sometimes it arrives with stillness, with no urge to reply, to convince, to explain, with no desire to fix what didn't consider you worth fixing, with no more need to sit at tables where your presence is taken for granted. Closure doesn't always come wrapped in apologies or explanations. Sometimes it comes in the form of silence you no longer chase, in the joy that no longer depends on who calls or who doesn't, in the peace of not wondering anymore why you weren't enough for them. You stop needing to understand why they hurt you. You just know you don't want to be hurt anymore. There is no revenge in walking away. There is no cruelty in saying, no more. There is only clarity. The kind that makes you protect your energy like a home that's been robbed too many times. You learn to lock the doors not out of fear, but out of wisdom. You learn that just because someone shares your name, your blood, your past, it doesn't mean they've earned your future. The heart doesn't harden. It heals. It no longer pulses with confusion. It no longer beats out of rhythm with guilt. It finds its own steady sound. And in that sound, you begin to rebuild. Not from what they left, but from what you reclaimed. You begin to notice peace in the smallest things, in mornings without tension, in holidays without pretending, in friendships that nourish instead of deplete, in the softness of solitude that doesn't feel like loneliness anymore. You notice that being alone is not the same as being abandoned, not when you've chosen yourself. You don't hate them. You don't wish them harm. You just no longer set yourself on fire to keep them warm. You no longer offer explanations for your absence. You no longer carry guilt that was never yours to begin with. You simply step into the space they once took for granted, and you fill it with your own light. They may still not understand. They may continue to speak about you in tones of confusion or critique, but none of that matters anymore, because they are no longer the voice you measure yourself by. They are no longer the mirror you stand in front of. You found a new reflection, one that shows you whole, even if they never saw it. You remember the ache of being forgotten, but it no longer defines you. You remember the sting of being left out, but it no longer wounds you. You carry the memories, but they no longer weigh you down. You've learned how to walk without needing them to carry part of your worth. The world does not end when you choose yourself. It begins again. It becomes quieter, yes, but also more honest, more intentional, more free. You stop giving to be seen. You stop offering yourself as proof of your value. You stop waiting for someone else to validate the very thing you already know. You are not disposable, and from that truth, everything changes. You no longer chase relationships that require you to disappear. You no longer beg to stay in places that hurt you. You no longer smile through exclusion. You no longer confuse being tolerated with being loved. The life that forms around this clarity is not one of isolation. It's one of integrity. You find people who speak your language, who see you without requiring your silence. You create connections rooted in mutual care, not guilt. In truth, not obligation. In respect, not history alone. You find love again. Not the kind that demands your compromise, but the kind that welcomes your fullness. The kind that doesn't vanish when you say no. The kind that doesn't ask you to carry the relationship alone. And through it all, you begin to feel safe. Not because others changed, but because you did. You became the protector of your own spirit, the guardian of your own peace, the advocate of your own worth. You became the home you were waiting to be invited into. This is not cruelty. This is clarity. This is the end of explaining why you needed more. This is the beginning of giving that more to yourself. And in that space, no apology is necessary. Because you are not angry. You are not bitter. You are just done pretending exclusion doesn't hurt. You are done making yourself smaller to keep the peace. You are done performing okayness while breaking inside. You are done trying to belong in places that leave you out without hesitation. Now you belong to yourself, and that is the most sacred kind of belonging there is.